Have you ever experienced a piece of media that felt perfect, where every component fits just right? Some people might argue very reasonably that perfect media doesn't exist. How can you take something subjective and argue it's without fault? But what about another definition of perfect? Satisfying all requirements. Because while we can and often look at media critically, scaled to a larger medium and audience, it's also an individual experience. And I think a lot of people have media they'd consider to be perfect. But today we're not just exploring perfect stories, but specifically diving into a paradox, where that perfection is fleeting, and that's part of what makes it so interesting. Welcome to this week's video. My name is Pei, and today we're exploring the perfect media paradox. So there's this arguably weird stance I have when it comes to media, which is while it is a subjective medium, you can absolutely try to look at it objectively. I see it kind of like a spectrum. Just because art is subjective doesn't mean you can't build an argument praising or criticizing media, and hopefully that's supported with evidence. For example, if you were to ask 1,000 movie critics to create a list of 10 perfect movies, some would deny the premise, but of those who play along, you'd see certain movies recurringly pop up. For example, The Godfather might come up often. And you could change the sample group. You could ask children, teenagers, or adults, or people from different countries, or even people from different communities. What I'm really interested in is that media that consistently comes up across a large sample size that for individuals feel perfect. This was all inspired, by the way, by a TikTok from a creator named B Don's Movies, where he lists a bunch of perfect movies. And of the films I've seen, I found myself often agreeing, and of the ones I hadn't, I'd heard amazing things. I think there is something to the objectivity of good art, representing a larger statistical relationship of people's individual relationships with that art. Now, the reason I wanted to make this video is because when I listed off a bunch of pieces of art that I would consider to be perfect, I was shocked at how many of them were fleeting. I think Arcane Season 1 is perfect. I do not feel that about Season 2. And that difference is a really interesting lens to use to look at why I think Arcane Season 1 is so good. Now, a reasonable first impression of this might be that I'm only going to talk about media that fell off. However, each comparison we're making today I think is going to fall into its own unique category. We're going to be exploring fall-offs and step-ups in quality, living in the shadows of giants, enigmas, and volatility. Adapting an iconic story is hard, but if it's done right, it can be a game changer. Today's video is brought to you by JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Golden Spirit, officially releasing August 13th. Join your favorite characters in one of anime's most beloved IPs in a new exciting RPG adventure. JoJo's, without a doubt, has one of the most loyal and passionate fandoms I've ever seen. From its iconic style to compelling stories, you can tell this game is trying to capture that same magic. So play as your favorite characters from parts 1 through 6 and see how they interact, fight alongside faithfully recreated stand powers, recognize iconic characters doing signature poses, and re-experience an outstanding story, all while building a dream team of your favorite heroes and villains. Enjoy your favorite JoJo's moments in-game with a story that feels like the anime. Also, incredibly exciting news, Yugo Kanno, the composer responsible for both Stardust Crusaders and Steel Ball Run, created 3 unique tracks specifically for this release. So if you're hyped for the first global release of a JoJo mobile RPG, pre-registration has entered its final stage. Join now and help unlock milestone rewards with ultimate goal of a super rare Joseph Joestar by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment below. Thank you to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Golden Spirit for sponsoring this video. I remember very distinctly finding out that Riot Games, the developers of League of Legends, were creating a show based off of the in-universe lore. I was not unique in my sentiment of being super wary. Worst case, I assumed it would be like a terrible Marvel movie, and best case, it'd be like a good Marvel movie. I had no idea how they were going to navigate complex lore and stories about champions from the game with any sort of subtlety or care. But oh boy, was I wrong. I think Season 1 of Arcane is one of the best single seasons in all of television. And it was all based in telling a deeply grounded human story in a fantastical world. While they used League of Legends as a roadmap, it didn't feel restrictive at all. They weren't afraid to make changes from what we expected. Every episode was filled with amazing scenes and characters. The setting was completely immersive and the animation was one of the most beautiful I've seen. I think Arcane Season 1 was perfect, succeeding in all the things it set out to do. Arcane Season 2, however, lost track of the things I cared most about in this story. Now, something I do want to acknowledge is that Arcane Season 2 still has pretty positive general reception, though it's definitely more contentious than the first season, but for me there was a clear difference in quality. Arcane's second season fell prey to the things I was afraid the first season would. feeling like a poorly crafted superhero movie. They dumbed down and in some ways avoided a lot of the interesting political questions they raised in the first season. The season was packed full of too many moving parts that weren't fully fleshed out, and overall the story felt like it didn't have any room to breathe. There were still great peaks, outstanding animation, and moments that stood out, but the overall quality felt like a huge downgrade. My favorite episode in Season 2 actually fit terribly into the general pacing of the series. The 7th episode of Arcane's second season takes a step back, slows down. We follow a character named Echo as he's transported to an alternate timeline. We get this beautiful, slow romance that buds into something really special and significant. The thing is, they only had 2 episodes after this, and there were so many open questions that taking this step away from the primary plotline seemed like a total disaster. I loved that entire episode. I wish the entire season was like it, but with the writing decisions they had made up until that point, it felt like they had no time to make that choice. In the first season, they focused on a simpler plotline, which gave their outstanding character writing more room to breathe and develop. It felt like they rushed through nothing, but still the story was densely packed with fascinating plot choices. I think this is actually the most common form of perfect and imperfect media being paired together, a fall-off. Not because Arcane Season 2 was terrible, but because the first was perfect. Arguably the most praised story in all of anime and manga is One Piece. And at the core of this story is a very clear trade-off. It's really long, and to some people that's exactly what they want. To others, it's an insurmountable obstacle. This story is beloved for good reason, and I think criticized for good reason too. For any individual viewer, common critiques like the length, pacing, and lows potentially don't even bother them and could even be a plus. For someone who currently needs a distraction or wants to immerse themselves completely in something, having a mountain of media could be a total benefit. But I think for most, me included, it's a barrier to entry. It's hard to carve out that much time at this stage of my life to dedicate to a single piece of media. I prefer watching anime over reading manga, so the pacing and low moments in the story really hit with One Piece, barring time and time again my attempts to be fully immersed by it. But those critiques aren't the only aspects of One Piece. I think it's a story like no other, because it's filled to the brim with not only outstanding characters and moments, but some that you could argue are perfect. So that's what we're talking about here, volatility. Because there's a single episode of One Piece that I consider from start to finish to be perfect, consumable by One Piece diehards and those who aren't even familiar with the story, and it's called the One Piece fan letter. I made an entire video talking about this specific concept in February of 2025, but the synopsis is that the One Piece fan letter is one of my favorite short stories ever crafted. And it doesn't stop there because it ties perfectly into the longest story I've ever tried to consume. Its ability to capture such a large target audience with such care and craft is so impressive to me. Not only capturing the core essence of what I think makes the entire story special, but also destroying that barrier of entry by doing it so concisely, creating its own little perfect moments that are reminiscent of One Piece's best, perfectly, from start to finish, with characters you don't even know the names of. Taking the big, grand, magnificent world of One Piece and making it simple and grounded. So a major inspiration for this video is I've recently been replaying one of my favorite games of all time, Hades 2. To me, it did the impossible, following up a perfect game. It was ambitious, it implemented tons of new mechanics, many of which you would think wouldn't work, but do really well. Hades 2 managed the expectations of its predecessor incredibly well. And if you were to look at each aspect of the game on a radar graph, it performs fantastically. Each individual part is not only outstanding, but it holds up to an incredibly harsh standard set by its predecessor. I think Hades 2 is amazing, but I think the original is perfect. Somehow with art, there's this fascinating thing that happens when the sum of a project outweighs the whole of its parts. Sometimes great media is great because each individual part is outstanding. But in others, it's special because of something that's enigmatic, hard to pin down or express. Yet somehow I still hold Hades in higher regard despite Hades 2 doing the impossible, following up a masterpiece fantastically. Hades 2 found itself in a very tricky situation, having to emulate the structure of the first game while implementing new components in a way that makes it feel fresh. They added a lot, and despite my initial first impression, all of it worked. The gameplay loop is so satisfying, the writing is fantastic, the mechanics and additional components work perfectly. I also started replaying Hades 1 in preparation for this video, and it does feel a little bit antiquated, especially compared to the second game. It's rougher around the edges and missing some of the polish, but the story is so good. It's so hard to make good media. You're kind of figuring it out as you go so often, especially as an indie game developer. And the story and writing in the second game is far from weak, but there's something really special about Zagreus' story and his family drama and how grounded it ends up feeling. I think ultimately that has to do with the endings. The multiple endings for the original game's story all click together perfectly, maintaining simplicity while offering depth. Whereas with Hades 2, not only in the story but also with the game, there's just more complexity. And given the fact that this is a game first and a story second, I think some of that emotional depth was lost. Both games hold up beautifully in their primary goal of being a fun game to engage in. But there's something at the core of the first Hades that when I played it, felt more satisfying. An enigma that I'll continue to revisit as I come back and play these games time and time again. The first perfect piece of media I had a chance to consume as it aired was Avatar: The Last Airbender. I think there's a reason the story holds up as much as it does, offering incredible depth in a story that's completely approachable and enjoyable for children. Miyazaki films, Pixar, Bluey, Adventure Time, and Over the Garden Wall. These are all stories that are able to offer incredible depth despite primarily targeting children. I have great respect for people that are able to capture complex ideas in simple stories, making it consumable and enjoyable for all ages. Avatar starts as a kid's cartoon and evolves into so much more in a way that doesn't retcon anything that it established, but just expands upon it. I think it's a perfect piece of media that set an impossible standard to live up to. Look at the repeated failed live-action adaptations. But the imperfect pairing I want to analyze today is The Legend of Korra, living in the shadow of a giant. I think it's tragic that Korra's so poorly received because I don't think it's a bad show. Now, as I say that, I will acknowledge that I'm actually not the biggest fan. I think in a lot of ways it missed the core elements of what made me love Avatar. But that comparison is a brutal set of circumstance for it to exist in. Because outside of that context, what Korra tries to do, it does do well. It's a good cartoon. But the thing is, in comparison, I think it's really lackluster. The original Avatar showcased immense depth on every character that was part of the main cast. Aang, Sokka, Katara, Toph, Zuko, Iroh, Azula. In comparison, I think Korra had a hard time finding the right stride with its characters. Not weakly written, just often oversimplified and relegated to a specific role in the story. You know, how cartoons normally function, just not the ways they have to. Korra on its own actually would probably be very well received. I think that's why it has such a pronounced fandom even today, is people who didn't have Avatar as context or didn't care as much about the show liked what Korra had to offer. Beautiful animation, expanded world building, some interesting plot lines, exploration of bending in new and exciting ways, but a convoluted overarching story with sometimes neglected characters. I think these imperfect counterparts in many ways highlighted what made the original work so special. That's the thing about Korra, is it does something well by most modern standards in a vacuum, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And out of all the Avatar IP that have followed up after the initial series, it's actually one of the strongest. The last piece of media I want to introduce before exploring this idea as a whole is Chainsaw Man. One of my most popular videos is talking about Chainsaw Man's first season, and specifically the moment where I felt like it went from pretty good to great. This story is one of the most hyped adaptations in anime history. Before the controversial ending, in which I'm not actually familiar, of the manga, Tatsuki Fujimoto and Chainsaw Man were held in remarkably high regard by the manga community. I'm sure there's nuance to that entire conversation, so I'm not even going to really touch on it, but I am going to talk about the released anime. So I think the first season was pretty good and started to showcase why it was considered to be so special, but I think the recently released Reze Arc movie was perfect. For me, I loved the pacing. I think it was artsy in all the right ways, and it was filled to the brim with all the things I wanted from the series. Then it was packaged tightly in an hour and 40 minutes. I also think it, like the One Piece fan letter, did the incredibly challenging thing of being appealing to non-fans. Out of all the anime movies made from series I've seen, most are hard to follow or get engaged with, but the Reze Arc movie I think really worked for many people who weren't familiar with the story. And when I made a video about it 6 months ago, I literally sat down and watched it with one of my editors who hadn't read the manga or seen the anime. And with limited context, it worked really well. I think it's just a perfect piece of media. It does exactly what it sets out to do, which is the whole point of this video, to explore why perfect media feels so perfect, especially when it has a great example of a counterpart that isn't. It's very possible that people are going to get hung up on this trying to define perfect media part of the video, but you could just as easily interchange perfect with masterpiece. What makes Hades 1, the One Piece fan letter, Chainsaw Man Reze masterpieces? Why did The Legend of Korra, which is very strong, feel so lackluster in comparison to the original trilogy? I think a lot of these perfect pieces of media share certain unique qualities. The first being strong execution across the board. They don't have obvious weak points that are immediate barriers to entry or enjoyment. Hades does everything a game needs to do and some. Arcane Season 1 is a remarkable story that's also beautifully referential to its source material, going back to that concept of a radar graph having a bunch of different traits that do really well. But I think the second quality that makes these perfect pieces of media so special is harder to pin down: the X factor, something that goes above and beyond and really sticks with you. I think one of the best rated movies of all time is a good example of this, Shawshank Redemption. It's been #1 on IMDb forever, and it's there for good reason. Each individual component of the story on that graph is outstanding. But my favorite stories, the media I'd consider to be perfect, don't just do a good job, they excel in something. It can be a completely unique character or a shockingly satisfying ending. That's what all these stories that I talked about earlier offer. I think Season 2 of Arcane highlight just how important it was for Season 1 to feel grounded. I think the One Piece fan letter addresses its biggest problem, making it approachable and concise, while still capturing the same peaks. Avatar: The Last Airbender was more than just a kids show. Chainsaw Man grew into itself, and Hades 2, despite how strong it was, especially on paper, demonstrated that sometimes an intangible X factor can be a game changer. For every piece of media I talked about today, I guarantee there's someone out there that preferred the one I called imperfect to the one I called perfect. Some people liked Arcane Season 2 or Legend of Korra more than the originals. That applies to everything I talked about today, and I think that's kind of beautiful. Ultimately, art starts at an individual experience. It's created with intention, but then let go to be interpreted. Arguments about quality shouldn't invalidate individual experiences. Criticism and critique are meant to inform, not dictate or gatekeep. There's this interview I can't seem to find, I think it was with Donald Glover, where he talked about advice he received from an established female artist in the industry. It was something along the lines of, you don't get to choose how people listen. On cheap headphones, in a car, on a really bad day. There are tons of factors in the context of how we consume a piece of art that influence the way we perceive it, because it's all about personal resonance. And artists, by the nature of releasing art for people to engage with, can't control that. And learning to let go of that, understanding that people will dislike, misunderstand, or criticize something just because the context in which they consumed it, that's part of the game of creating stuff. Looking at art through a critical lens is meant to inform, to try to relate your individual experience to other people's individual experience, looking at it as a larger social structure, in an attempt to understand what makes the best art so special. That's why I compared quote-unquote perfect and imperfect media today, because I think it changed the perspective in which I look at these pieces of media that I consider to be perfect, and even in some cases changed the way I looked at the media I consider to be imperfect. I was never a very big fan of Korra, but I think that had more to do with me and the context than the quality of the show. It's obviously hard to live in the shadows of a giant given the fact that every other Avatar adaptation has grossly failed. Art's really cool, and I love understanding why, because it means a world to a lot of people, me included. So I'm going to leave you with a question. What media to you feels perfect? And much more importantly, why?